So fellas, I did a GOAT list video a while back where I talked about my top 30 greatest MMA fighters of all time, but now I'm going to be critiquing every fighter on that list, so going through each fighter on the list, critiquing them, how you could argue against them being one of the greatest of all time, and also how they could be higher on the GOAT list if they had to rechange their career, or if they're still active, what path they need to go down to be higher on the GOAT list. And I mean, this isn't in any order, by the way, so it's not like this is the actual list of my GOAT list, isn't the order it was in, and this is just randomized. But we'll start off with Ilia Topuria. I think the biggest critique you can give to Topuria is the fact that he's only become a champion this year and he only has one title defense. When you think of the greatest of all time, like the likes of Jon Jones and GSP, you're thinking of guys with massive longevity, guys that have been around for like decades. Topuria's only become a champion this year and he's only had one title defense, and considering that defenses are a big part of being the greatest of all time, he hasn't been on a title reign. Now granted, the two guys that he did beat for the belt were arguably the best back-to-back wins in UFC history, but he's only won the belt this year. I mean, a year ago from now, even coming into this year, people didn't even know if he was going to become a champion, so he's very early on in his career. He's only like 27 years old, I think. I don't know his exact age, but the fact that he's only become a champion this year, he hasn't really had a reign, and he's only got one defense is, I guess, what you can do to argue against Topuria being one of the GOATs. But how could he be higher on the GOAT list? It's pretty simple. Just keep defending the belt and potentially win the lightweight belt. I think if Topuria can defend the belt a few more times, maybe against the likes of Lopez or Yair Rodriguez, Arnold Allen, whoever is up and coming in the featherweight division, if he can just defend the belt a few more times, I think he's already made it to the top 20 greatest of all time. And if he can actually win the lightweight belt by going up and beating Makhachev at 155, I think he's in the top 10. So I think he just needs to defend the belt a few more times, win that 155 belt if he really wants to give his career a massive boost and create a massive legacy for himself. But those are the arguments you can make against Topuria being one of the greatest of all time and how he could be higher on the GOAT list. Then we've got Jose Aldo. Aldo's definitely spoken as one of the greatest of all time. Some people think he's the greatest in the featherweight division. I think he definitely deserves to be in the top 10, maybe even the top 5 I'd put him in. But the reasons against Aldo being one of the GOATs is he went 3-6 from 2015 to 2020. Now, obviously, this was kind of out of his prime, but the fact that he did go 3-6 kind of shows a lack of longevity in those years. And he lost to the new generation of elites. Now, I'm not saying he lost to the new generation full stop, because he's still able to pick wins over Jonathan Martinez. He's had a ton of wins in the bantamweight division. I think he should have beaten Mario Batista. But specifically the new generation of elites, like he got finished by Max Holloway twice. He got beaten comfortably, not comfortably, but he got beaten by Alexander Volkanovski. He got finished by Conor McGregor. So the new generation of elite featherweights in McGregor, Holloway, and Volkanovski, he just wasn't able to get past, and he did lose to the new generation of elites. And he's arguably not even the greatest featherweight. Now, I personally do think Aldo's the greatest of all time in the featherweight division, but if there's a debate to be made that you're not even the greatest in your own weight class, it's kind of hard to argue that you are the greatest of all time. So for Jose Aldo, that's the arguments you can have against him. How could he be higher on the GOAT list? I think the career that he's had so far, I wouldn't really critique him anything on that, but I would say continue picking up wins in the bantamweight division and potentially go on a title run. He's still in the bantamweight division, and I'd say he's still a top fighter. Like, he beat Jonathan Martinez in Brazil comfortably, looked great in that fight, looked better than he did in his previous fights at bantamweight. And in his last fight, he fought Mario Batista, who I thought he should have beaten on the night. And I think if he can just keep picking up wins in the bantamweight division, potentially even go on a title run, climb the rankings, I think that would definitely add to the career and the legacy and obviously the longevity of Jose Aldo. So that would be my advice on how we could be higher on the GOAT list. Not really advice, but if I had to give him an ideal career path, that would be it, and also the argument you can make against him being the GOAT. Then we've got Makhachev. In my opinion, definitely, well, it's not even just my opinion, it's a fact, he's definitely top 15 greatest of all time. The argument against Makhachev, he isn't as dominant as Khabib. He gets compared to Khabib a lot, especially in the lightweight division when it comes to the lightweight GOAT, and in my opinion, he just wasn't as dominant. He was in a dogfight and nearly got finished by Volkanovski. He even was in a dogfight with Dustin Poirier, which I would argue is one of the easiest stylistic contenders to beat. He's only beat 3 opponents during his title reign. He's beat Charles Oliveira, he's beat Volkanovski, and he's beaten Dustin Poirier. Those are the only 3 guys he's beaten. Obviously rematched Volkanovski as well, but I think to have a long career, you've got to beat a lot of top opponents, and it seems like with Makhachev, it's just Volkanovski twice, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier. Now it looks like we're going to be getting another Oliveira rematch after the Arman Sarukian rematch, and I think he's still got work to do. Again, still one of the greatest of all time, but the dude's still got work to do. I don't think his career's over. I hope he doesn't retire early like Khabib. I think he can potentially go win the belt in the 170 weight class, which kind of brings me to my next point, which is how could he be higher on the GOAT list? Keep defending the belt, defend against Arman Sarukian, defend against Oliveira again, keep that belt warm in the lightweight division, because I really don't see anyone taking it off him, and cement yourself as the undeniable greatest lightweight featherweight of all time, and potentially win the welterweight belt if Belal loses it. I can understand why Makhachev doesn't want to move up if Belal's champion, because they're obviously former training partners. But if Belal loses the belt, maybe if Shavkat wins the belt or something like that, go and try win the welterweight belt, double champ status. He almost did it when Leon was the champion. I think if Belal loses the belt, you've got to give him that double champ opportunity. I think he's earned it. Henry Cejudo. I definitely put Cejudo in the GOAT list as well. Double champ status before. Had a great run. The argument against Cejudo is that he retired way too early. This dude was so dumb to retire in his prime. His prime only lasted 2 years because he could have lasted a lot longer. Who knows what he could have gotten achieved. But then the dude retired in his prime. He had a really short title reign because of it as well. And he looked terrible in his UFC comeback. He came back to the UFC a couple of years later, got beaten by Sterling and Marab, and he's just not really looked the same. So those are the arguments against Cejudo now. How could he be higher on the GOAT list? He should have kept fighting in his prime. I know he was demanding money, but it was a dumb thing to do. If this dude had just kept fighting in his prime, he could have been the greatest bantamweight of all time above Dominick Cruz. He could have gone on to have a great career, become one of the all-time GOATs. Now, if we're talking about what he should do nowadays, I guess he should try and pick up a win against some up-and-comers in the bantamweight division, similar to what Jose Aldo's doing. Pick up a win against some of the up-and-comers, but he did kind of screw his career by retiring in his prime when he was his absolute best. Then for Fedor Emelianenko, arguably the greatest featherweight of all time. I definitely think he's I definitely think he's top 2 greatest featherweights of all time with Stipe. Arguments against Fedor, he never competed in the UFC. The UFC is kind of seen as the prestige league when it comes to MMA. He never competed in the UFC. A lot of people kind of rule him out because of that. He's arguably a can crusher. People like to call Fedor Emelianenko a can crusher. He was beating these roid heads that had no idea what they were doing. He was beating these guys. Obviously, I don't agree with this, but a lot of people like to use the argument that he was a can crusher and he wasn't really beating elite opponents. And he did fall off in the later half of his career. He kind of stopped training as seriously. And even on the topic of a late career, the dude was fighting until like 46 years old, which is crazy. So what could he have done to be higher on the GOAT list? I don't think he should have slowed the training down in later half of his career. He decided to slow training down and pursue other things, and I thought that definitely was a reason why he kind of fell off. He should not have fought until 46 years old. I get it, in the heavyweight division your longevity is longer, but 46 is crazy. I think 42 is like the maximum you should be able to go in the heavyweight division. And I think he should have beaten UFC competition. I don't know why he didn't join the UFC in the early days of the UFC, because I genuinely think at the time he could have ran the UFC as well, which would definitely would have boosted him to be arguably the greatest of all time in the heavyweight division. So those are the arguments for, and those are the arguments against Fedor and how he could have changed, or how he could have improved his career. Dustin Poirier. Now, the argument against Poirier being one of the greatest of all time is that he never became a champion. I said in the GOAT video that I think Poirier is the greatest fighter to never win a belt, but some people might think that if you've never won a belt, then you simply can't be one of the greatest of all time because you couldn't even win a belt in your own weight class. And he has lost to a handful of elite fighters: Conor McGregor, Justin Gaethje, Khabib, Makhachev. I'm not going to go through the entire list, but he has lost to quite a handful of elite fighters. He's always been a top contender as Dustin Poirier, but he's never actually been able to win the belt. Charles Oliveira have won as well, so the fact that he has lost to a lot of elite fighters, he's never really been the best in the world, and he never became a champion, is the biggest critique you can give to Poirier. How could he be higher? I think there's not really much he could have done. He's always been a top contender doing the right decisions. I think maybe he could have gone for the kill against Oliveira when he dropped him rather than being too scared to engage, because in hindsight, when Makhachev did, and I know Makhachev's an elite grappler, it worked, but he could have potentially won a belt, beat Oliveira. That would have definitely boosted his career. But as far as how he could have been higher, there's not really any obvious answer for Dustin Poirier. I think what he did in the UFC was well, he did the best he could, in my opinion. Stipe Miocic, like I just said, just fought UFC 309, got finished by Jones, but I still think he's the greatest heavyweight of all time as far as accomplishments go. Now, the arguments against him: 5 losses throughout his UFC career. When you think of the greatest of all time, losing 5 times isn't a good look, especially when you're the GOAT of the division. And he did fight in the most uncompetitive division. I know that's kind of it's kind of ironic because Stipe is also in that division, so you can kind of call him uncompetitive as well. But I feel like accomplishments in the heavyweight division don't mean as much as accomplishments in, let's say, the lightweight division. So those are the arguments you can kind of make against Stipe. How he could have been higher on the GOAT list: he shouldn't have been so small for the Ngannou fight. I don't know if this is true, but I read something, I didn't read something, but I'm pretty sure Stipe was so small in the Ngannou fight because apparently he liked being light against DC, and he had to be small for some sort of what's his job again, a fireman job that he had to be like a certain size for it. So apparently he was really small for the Ngannou fight, which he was, and I definitely don't think that benefited him when he got chinned and he was so undersized, especially when you're a wrestler and you want the weight advantage. And I think he should have retired after the Ngannou loss. Coming back against Jon Jones was a dumb decision. We all called it out. We all said Aspinall should have been next. And after he got put to sleep by Ngannou, that should have been it for Stipe Miocic. He should have hung the gloves up, especially taking 3 years off as well, 4 years off as well, after getting knocked out by Ngannou. So I think that's what he could have done to be higher on the GOAT list, and the arguments you can have against him. Alex Pereira, definitely one of the GOATs, had arguably the most accomplished UFC career in the shortest amount of time. Arguments against him: he hasn't really had a long career. Similar to the Topuria point, the dude debuted in 2021. When you think of the all-time GOATs, like I said with Topuria, you think of these guys with careers that have been decades long. Poaton's only been in the UFC since 2021, and people say he ran 2 divisions. He's only really been able to run the light heavyweight division of today, which is a division where people are changing, the belt's changing hands constantly. He didn't, he wasn't active in the light heavyweight division, the peak of the division when Jones and DC and Gustafsson were about, and it isn't even like he beat much top opposition in the middleweight division. He beat Strickland and Izzy. Those were his best wins in the middleweight division, his only notable wins, and he's 1-1 with Izzy in the UFC as well, so he didn't really run the middleweight division. He got knocked out in his last fight, and even though he is the king of the light heavyweight division, it's in a bit of a bad state. Is the light heavyweight not a bad state? There's definitely a lot of killers and fun fighters right now, but it's not the prestige era of the light heavyweight division. Now, what he could have done to be higher on the GOAT list, I think he needs to beat Ankalaev. I think Ankalaev's the toughest matchup for Poaton in the light heavyweight division, so if he can beat Ankalaev, as far as I'm concerned, he's cleared out the division, and moving up to heavyweight and going on a heavyweight run would be insane as well. Now, I don't think he beats Aspinall, I don't think he beats Jones, but if somehow Poaton can move up a weight class, win a belt in a 3rd weight class, be the first ever fighter to win a belt in 3 weight classes, be a stylistic nightmare, and go on to achieve that as well, I think he'd arguably have an argument to make to be the greatest of all time, regardless of anything else. So that's how he could be higher on the GOAT list and the critiques you can make against him. Frankie Edgar, one of the GOATs of the lightweight division. Arguments against Edgar is he's only had a few title defenses. He hasn't had this long list of title defenses in the lightweight division. He did lose to a lot of the top competition in his prime as well. I'm not gonna, like, for example, with Aldo, you can use the excuse that he lost to the elite fighters after his prime. Well, Frankie Edgar was losing to a lot of the elite fighters in his prime, losing to the likes of Henderson and all these other guys in the lightweight division that he was losing to in his prime as well. And he did fall off towards the end of his career. He definitely had a fall off. I think he lost like 4 of his last 5 UFC fights. And again, this is a problem with longevity for Frankie Edgar. Those are the arguments you can make against him being one of the GOATs. Now, how he could be higher in the GOAT list? He should have retired when he needed to. It felt like the UFC were just trying to force a send-off win for Frankie Edgar. They were trying to force a send-off win, have a nice, happy ending in MSG, and then it just kept resulting in him in getting knocked out. And even though I don't really like looking at fighters past their prime and judging their entire career based off that, he should have retired when he needed to. It would have protected his legacy a lot more, and he should have just stopped trying to force a send-off win and kept getting knocked out every other event. Then we've got Dominick Cruz, in my opinion, the greatest bantamweight of all time. Now, the argument against him is he's a champion in a division without any major GOATs. I'd say the bantamweight division, and I don't mean this from a competitive standpoint, because bantamweight is definitely one of the most competitive divisions in the UFC. But as far as the GOATs go, Dominick Cruz has probably got the weakest accomplishments out of all the GOATs of every division. So what I'm trying to say is he's a champion in a division without many major GOATs. If someone in the bantamweight division comes along and can defend for a few times, they're probably going to overtake Dominick Cruz. He's only got 4 title defenses, which when discussed amongst a lot of the GOATs isn't that impressive. I mean, it's impressive if you're an average champion, but in comparison to the GOATs, it's not. And he wasn't even like he was beating the... I mean, he was definitely beating the elite in his prime, but he had a close fight with TJ Dillashaw. He did win the fight, but it was very close. Could have gone either way, and he got dominated by Cody Garbrandt in one of the biggest fights of his career. Got dominated for 25 minutes straight by Cody Garbrandt, lost the belt to him. So those are the arguments you can make against Dominick Cruz. How he could have been higher in the GOAT list? I don't think he should have taken that much time off after the Vera KO. Obviously, in his last fight, he got knocked out by Moll and Vera back in 2022. He shouldn't have taken that much time off. He should have been back, not ASAP, because yeah, he needed to recover, but he shouldn't have taken that much time off. I think he should have taken the Jose Aldo route, beat these up-and-coming guys. He said he wants one more send-off, and it's a little bit too late now for Cruz because he's so old. But I think if he took like 6 to 8 months off after getting knocked out by a Vera, he could have come back and beaten some of these up-and-comers in the bantamweight division at the time and potentially improved his bantamweight legacy. That's what I think Dominick Cruz can do. So hopefully we still do see him in. I've heard there's a rumor that him and Aldo are going to fight in like some sort of legacy retirement fight, which I don't mind, even though I think he gets absolutely destroyed by Aldo at this moment in time. But that's how he could have been higher on the GOAT list and the arguments you can make against him. Then we've got Anderson Silva. Some people think he's the greatest of all time, full stop. Now, the argument against Silva is he was beating up low levels of competition. Now, even though he was absolutely styling on them and he was levels above everyone, he wasn't fighting the... I mean, he was fighting the elite competition at the time, but at the time doesn't really mean much. He just wasn't beating up the highest level of competition. You know, he was getting knockout wins over the likes of Forrest Griffin. And when you think of Forrest Griffin in the history of middleweight, I mean, even though he's definitely a pioneer of the division, he's not one of the GOATs. I mean, when you think of the greatest of all time, the whole point is to be the greatest of all time, greatest of multiple different eras, and Anderson Silva just wasn't that. I mean, he only won 1 out of his last 9 fights in the UFC, which is crazy, so he definitely had a massive fall-off towards the end of his career, and he was on steroids. Some people completely disregard you from the GOAT list if you took steroids. Silva happened to take steroids. Those are the arguments you can make against him. How he could have been higher on the GOAT list? This dude shouldn't have showboated against Chris Weidman. I think he would have easily beaten Chris Weidman had he not showboated and got caught. And who knows how far he could have gone, because obviously in the rematch against Weidman, he snapped his leg. And that may never happen. If you look at like a canon event kind of thing, if he'd have gone out there and beaten Chris Weidman, who knows how far this dude could have gone and how long his prime could have lasted in the middleweight division if he hadn't have had to take so much time off. He could have ran the middleweight division for even longer than he actually did. And I think he should have retired much earlier. Retiring in, what was it, 2020 when he retired is way too late for Anderson Silva. He should have retired back in like 2013, 2014, rather than trying to drag on his career and pick up a win. I know he picked up a win over Derek Brunson, but, I mean, come on. It just wasn't worth the fighting for so long, so he should have retired much earlier. Shouldn't have showboated against Weidman. That's how he could have been higher in the arguments you can make against him. Then, for Francis Ngannou, I actually think Ngannou should be in the GOAT list. I think he's the perfect fighter to represent the heavyweight division. Just a pure, powerful dude who's beaten so many former champions. But the arguments you can make against Ngannou is he's had a short UFC title reign. A lot of his wins were past their prime as well. Yeah, Ngannou had a very short title reign in the UFC. He won the belt off Stipe Miocic, defended it against Cyril Gane a year later, and then decided to strip the belt to go and, well, decided to give up the belt to go and pursue boxing, which I think was a good career move. But if we're talking purely in the UFC, it was a very short reign. And a lot of his wins were fighters past their prime. Like, he fought Velasquez and Arlovski, and even though these are former champions, these guys weren't in their prime. You can even make an argument to say that Stipe, even though he definitely deserves a shot at the time, wasn't in his prime when he fought Ngannou. So a lot of his wins were fighters that were past their prime. Now, how he could have been higher on the GOAT list, again, I'm not saying he should have left the he shouldn't have left the UFC, because I think for a career perspective it made Ngannou, but had he wanted to be higher on the GOAT list, he should have continued to sleep people in the UFC. I don't know who he would have fought had he beaten Cyril Gane instead in the UFC, but I think he would have held onto that belt for a very long time. I don't think Jones would have returned, so I think he should have just continue sleeping people in the UFC, creating a proper title reign. And now, if we talk about what he should do now, just dominate PFL for the next few years. Dominate the top competition in PFL. I know PFL is the B League. It's not viewed as the best fighters in the world. But basically just dominate every heavyweight outside of the UFC that you can possibly do. That's all Ngannou can really do. He ain't coming back to the UFC. So if I had to give Ngannou like a career path on how we could potentially go higher in the GOAT list, that would be it. Then we've got Kamaru Usman. Second greatest welterweight of all time. Dana White thinks he's the greatest welterweight of all time. Now, the argument against Usman being one of the GOATs is his title reign wasn't super impressive. Now, I don't mean in the sense that he never looked good or he wasn't able to run the division, but you really look at the opponents he was beating. He beat Colby Covington twice. He beat Masvidal twice. And apart from that, it was a washed Tyron Woodley in Gilbert Burns. That's his entire title run. And even though at the time it was impressive, if you really look back at it and think of how uncompetitive Masvidal and Colby are doing against some of today's welterweights, was it that impressive? On top of that, he's 0-3 in his last 3. And even though Usman's definitely not necessarily in his prime, it wasn't far from his prime. Like when he fought Leon the second and the third time, he was only just leaving his prime. So you can't really make the excuses he was washed up by this time. 0-3 in his last 3. Leon beat him fair and square as well. He knocked him out cold. And then in the rematch, in the trilogy, he beat him by decision. So I think Leon beat him fair and square. And obviously he lost to Chimaev as well. Those are the arguments you can make against Usman being one of the GOATs. Now, how could he be higher on the GOAT list? He shouldn't have taken the Chimaev fight on short notice, simple as that. I don't understand what Usman was thinking. I mean, obviously, we all wanted it to happen to save UFC 294. But if we're thinking from a career perspective, taking on Chimaev on 10 days' notice, and then nowadays he's getting offers for like 3 months' notice and he refuses. I just don't really understand his point of view. Shouldn't have taken the Chimaev fight if we're talking about protecting his legacy. And I think he should honestly retire before it hurts his legacy. I know there's rumours of him coming back and fighting for the belt again and potentially against Bilal. But he's old. He's on a losing streak. He's got terrible knees. I don't really think he has anything to offer. He's been out for a year. If I was Usman, if we're talking in terms of protecting legacy, I think he should just retire before he fights an up-and-comer and loses again. So that would be my advice for Usman, to be higher on the GOAT list than what he should have done in his career. Then we've got Khabib. Overrated GOAT, underrated GOAT. Some people don't even include him in the top 15. Some people think he's number 1. I think he's definitely up there, arguably the greatest lightweight of all time. Now, the argument against Khabib is that he only had 3 title defenses. You can't be classed as the greatest of all time with only 3 title defenses. You didn't have a long reign, and it was against favourable matchups. Dustin Poirier, he's been submitted further since then by Makhachev and Oliveira. Conor McGregor, I mean, he had good wrestling in that fight, but getting a win over Conor McGregor in hindsight wasn't that impressive, especially back in 2018. Justin Gaethje, I mean, it was a good win again, but it's not like he beat... If he'd have gone out there and beaten the likes of Oliveira or a stylistic nightmare, I guess we could have given him the credit more, but he's only had 3 title defenses. He spent half of his career fighting Cain. You look at who Khabib was fighting when he was 15-0. When he was 15-0, he was fighting guys that were making their professional debut. I'm not saying that's exactly who he fought when he was 15-0, but what I'm trying to say is the first 15 fights, he was fighting super low level competition, and he retired way too early. I understand why he retired. I'm not saying he should have continued retiring. I understand why, but if we're talking in the perspective of the greatest of all time, the dude retired way too early. After 3 title defenses, the dude had already given up his belt. So those are the arguments you can make against Khabib. How he could be higher on the GOAT list, in my opinion, he should have just kept continuing to dominate the lightweight division. Rack up more title defenses rather than trying to protect a perfect record. And what would have made it impressive as well, had he kept on going, his next title defense would have been against a really tough matchup stylistically. It would have been against either Michael Chandler coming off that knockout win over Dan Hooker, or it would have been Charles Oliveira. 2 very tough matchups for Khabib. I still think he beats both of them, obviously, but from a stylistic perspective, they were very difficult fights, which would have added to his legacy had he been able to beat those guys. So I think he should have continued to dominate the lightweight division. Stop trying to protect the perfect record. Who cares if he picks up a loss? He probably wouldn't have picked up a loss anyway, considering how the lightweight division has looked in the past few years. But yeah, that's how Khabib could have been higher on the GOAT list and the arguments against him. Randy Couture. Now, for Randy Couture, I actually can't really think of anything he could have done back in his career to kind of help or to kind of make him even greater than he already is. But the arguments against Randy Couture is that he couldn't really hold on to the belt after winning it. It seems like every single time Randy Couture won the belt, he'd then lose it in his next fight, and then he'd win it again, maybe get a defense, and then he'd immediately lose it again. So he just wasn't really able to hold on for the belt. He didn't really have the best dominance over the division, and he was more of a pioneer than a GOAT. I feel like Randy Couture in the GOAT conversation, he's more of a pioneer, if anything. He's not really one of the greatest of all time. I mean, he's definitely one of the greatest of all time, but I feel like people remember him more for being a pioneer of the UFC, and I haven't actually gotten how he could be higher on the GOAT list, because I don't think there's any obvious answer for how Randy Couture could have been higher. So that's simply the argument you can have against Randy Couture. Couldn't really hold on to the belt, more of a pioneer. And then for Demetrious Johnson, top 3 greatest of all time. I mean, without a doubt, one of the most disrespected fighters by the UFC, and he happens to be one of the greatest of all time. Arguments against Demetrious Johnson is simply that the talent pool in the flyweight division wasn't big enough. I can't really critique any career moves from Demetrious Johnson as at this moment in time, because, I mean, he's had a pretty perfect career. But I just feel like you can make an argument to say the talent in the flyweight division wasn't big enough. It was a very new division when Demetrious Johnson was in his prime. And it would have been nice to see him in the UFC a little bit longer. Imagine him against the likes of Davis and Figueiredo or Brandon Moreno or some of today's elite flyweights in the past couple of years. So I just feel like the talent pool in the flyweight division wasn't big enough. How could he be higher on the GOAT list? Become a trash talker. I know, obviously, I'm not saying he should have done this because it would have been against his character. But if we were honestly talking in how to save his legacy, to save the flyweight division, it needed interest. Dana White was making him fight on Fight Night main events for a belt. If he'd have become a trash talker or a promotable guy personality-wise, it could have brought more eyes to the flyweight division. And I think he should have just continued his reign in the UFC. I'm not saying he had a complete control over this, but rather than allowing Ben Askren to take his place, if we're talking legacy-wise, who knows how great Demetrious Johnson could have been had he stayed in the flyweight division for a lot longer. I know he started to lose a couple of fights in the later half of his flyweight career, but if he's just stuck in the flyweight division, who knows how far Demetrious Johnson could have gone? Who knows the names they could have beaten? Who knows how many title defenses he could have had? I mean, for all we know, he could have still been competing to this day. So those are the arguments against Demetrious Johnson and how he could have been higher. Then we have Cain Velasquez, one of the most dominant heavyweights of all time in his prime. But the arguments against Cain Velasquez is he got brutally knocked out by Francis Ngannou in his last fight. It's not a good look where in your last MMA fight you get brutally KO'd. I'm kind of dragging it to say bad things about Cain Velasquez. And he didn't defend as much as Stipe Miocic. I mean, Stipe is viewed as the heavyweight GOAT. Cain Velasquez didn't defend as much as Stipe, so you can argue that he's not even the GOAT in his own division. But it's kind of hard to look at his career and critique him, considering I'm pretty sure he only had like 4 losses or 2 losses. He had very few losses on his career. and he was one of the most dominant heavyweights of all time. So those are the only arguments I can make against him. Now, how he could have been higher on the GOAT list is he had a great career, but I don't think he should have returned after the 3 years off against the scariest puncher heavyweight has seen. I don't know who told him this would be good, but the dude took 3 years off the UFC after a win as well to come back against Francis Ngannou, the scariest puncher heavyweight has ever seen. That was a terrible career move. He shouldn't have returned, and he would have retired off a win as well with one less loss on his name. So that's simply what I think Cain Velasquez could have done to become greater. Then we've got BJ Penn, one of the most underrated guys on the GOAT list. I do feel like nowadays people are starting to respect BJ Penn a lot more, but in this dude's prime, he was a killer. But the arguments you can make against him, as good as he was never super consistent. You never really got to see BJ Penn go on these big winning streaks and dominate the divisions. I say divisions because he never really stuck to one division, but he never really was super dominant for the longest time. He wasn't really consistent. It seemed like he'd pick up a couple of wins and then he'd lose, and then he'd win again and beat the shit out of somebody else, and then he'd go to a war with somebody else. So he wasn't really consistent. He won only one of his last 11. He's gotten one of the biggest losing streaks in UFC history, winning only one of his last 11. And his record's 16-14. I know a lot of that is, you know, the later half of his career. He was way past his prime. But a record of 16-14 is hard to argue that somebody can be the greatest of all time when they've got nearly as much losses as they have wins. But how could he be higher on the GOAT list? I think he should have retired after the 2010 Matt Hughes win. He got a good win over Matt Hughes back in 2010. At this moment in time, he had a record of 16-7. And had he retired, he wouldn't have gone on this big losing streak. People would have remembered for being the killer he is rather than being this drunk guy getting knocked out on the street. And he would have had a pretty solid record as well. So I think had he retired after the win over Matt Hughes back in 2010, I think it would have been much better for BJ Penn's career. Then for DC, definitely one of the GOATs. Only ever lost to Stipe and Jones. Obviously, Stipe twice and Jones once because the other one was a no contest. So, for DC, the arguments you can make against him is that he couldn't really get past the best heavyweight at the time in Stipe Miocic, and you couldn't really get past the best light heavyweight at the time in Jon Jones. He became a champion after Jones got stripped from the belt for steroids. But if we're being serious, when he was active, he was never the best in each division. He wasn't the best when Jones was around because Jones was the best. Even when he moved up to heavyweight, he wasn't the best in that division. Obviously, when he KO'd Stipe, he was. But if you look at it in hindsight, when they had his rivalry with Stipe, he wasn't the best. So the fact that he was never the best in both divisions is kind of hurts his career. And he didn't really have a super long reign. I mean, when he went to the light heavyweight division, obviously fought Jones, lost that, and then he got stripped from the belt, got an immediate title shot against Volkan Oezdemir. He defended a few times, moved up to heavyweight, beat Stipe, then lost to Stipe, and that was pretty much his entire title reign for DC. So we didn't really have this super long reign. Now, the argument, well, how could you argue that DC could be higher on the GOAT list? Nothing really in his control to boost him on the GOAT list. When you look at DC's career, there's nothing that he really did bad. I mean, it wasn't like at the time he did anything that was terrible. It's easy to go and say that he should have never fought Stipe the third or the second time, but at the time, that was the right thing to do. So there's nothing really in his control to boost him on the GOAT list. I think he did the best career he could possibly have, and he had a pretty good career at that. Then we've got GSP. Some would say he is the greatest of all time. I think he's the second greatest of all time behind Jon Jones. The argument against GSP is he lost to Matt Serra. Losing to Matt Serra is one of the greatest of all time. Not only losing, but getting finished by Matt Serra isn't a good look. He was a bit of a decision machine. He wasn't going out there and absolutely destroying. I mean, he was destroying people, but he wasn't absolutely finishing people and crumpling them early on. He was a bit of a decision machine. He had a lot of close fights. A lot of people seem to think that Johnny Hendricks was able to beat GSP, despite at the time he was absolutely jacked up on steroids. So those are the only really arguments you can make against GSP. It's hard to look for any major arguments because he's had a pretty solid MMA career. How he could have been higher on the GOAT list? He did everything a GOAT could have done, to be fair. I mean, you look at his career, it was pretty spectacular. There's not much you can really advise him to do. Potentially defend his middleweight belt. You know, when he beat the belt, when he beat Michael Bisping for the middleweight belt, he could have potentially defended it, maybe against Robert Whittaker or some of the other up-and-comers at the time. Had he got a defense in a different division, it would have been much more impressive. Obviously, we just recently saw Jon Jones, light heavyweight champ, takes some time off, wins the heavyweight belt, and then defends it. Had GSP done the same thing, it would have made his career a little bit better, but it's hard to look at GSP's career and point out flaws because it's pretty much a flawless career. Then we've got Volkanovski, one of the GOATs. I hope this dude picks up a win. Apparently he's going to be fighting in Perth next year against Lopez, and I just hope he pulls through. It's unlikely because of how dangerous Lopez is, but I hope he pulls through. Definitely one of the GOATs. Arguments against Volkanovski is he has lost 3 of his last 4 fights. I mean, when I'm discussing a lot of GOATs on this video, we keep discussing how they tend to fall off in the later half of his career, later half of their career, and it kind of seems like Volkanovski is now doing that. I mean, the fight with Makhachev was super close, then he beats Yair Rodriguez, and now he's lost his last 2 by knockouts in the first round and the first 2 rounds, so He does seem to be kind of having a bit of a downfall on the end of his career. Just got beaten by Topuria, just got beaten by Makhachev. And again, he's arguably not even the featherweight GOAT. You can make a big argument that Jose Aldo's the greatest featherweight of all time. I personally think Aldo's the greatest featherweight of all time. It's very close between him and Aldo, but again, the fact that he arguably not even the greatest of all time in your own division is something that you can have against Volkanovski. How he could be higher on the GOAT list? He shouldn't have fought Islam on short notice. That was a super dumb thing to do. Again, he was saving the card just like Usman did when he fought Chimaev. But Islam was his toughest test in his MMA career. It was his only loss in the UFC at the time. It was a super competitive fight. It would have made much more sense to have a full training camp to fight Makhachev and to potentially beat him and achieve greatness than fight him on super short notice and, you know, have a complete risk. And obviously it was a risk because he ended up getting sparked out in the first round. And what he would do from now on, I think he should beat up Evan Sterling. I don't think we throw him straight in the deep end against Topuria or Lopez. Give him the winner of Evan Sterling. Very winnable for Volkanovski. No knockout threat. Gives him that not the experience, but gives him that time back in the octagon where he can kind of get used to it. And then from there, hope to win that belt back against Topuria and Lopez. Unlikely, but if he can do it, he's a 2-time featherweight champion. That's super impressive. Israel Adesanya. Argument against Adesanya is he was a champion during middleweight's worst period. People overhype not that he wasn't dominant, but look at who Adesanya was beating for the belt. Jared Cannonier, decision. Marvin Vettori, decision. Robert Whittaker, I know he knocked him out the first time, but the second time it was a very controversial decision. Yoel Romero, decision. And then it was Paulo Costa, whose best win is Luke Rockhold at 50 years old. He was a middleweight champion during middleweight's worst period. Do you put Prime Izzy in today's middleweight division? I'm going to be honest, maybe it's just a hot take. I don't think he even becomes a champion. I don't think Prime Izzy becomes a champion in today's middleweight division. He was a champion during its worst period, and he's 1-3 in his last 4. Got finished by Alex Pereira, finished by Dricus du Plessis, dog-walked by Sean Strickland. When you look at it, today's middleweights, obviously Polton's not today's middleweights, but when you look at some of today's middleweights and how he's losing so dominantly to these guys, it's not a good look for Izzy, and he failed the light heavyweight move up during his prime when Izzy was in his peak of his career, moved up to light heavyweight against Jan Blachowicz, the same guy that got finished by Glover Teixeira, and he lost pretty comfortably to Jan Blachowicz as well. So those are the arguments you can have against Izzy. How he could be higher? He should have taken more career risks. I think he should have taken more in-fight risks. He shouldn't have been such a leg kicker. He shouldn't have tried to have such a safe style. I think for Israel Adesanya becoming a little bit more dangerous in his fights, a bit more reckless, you can make an argument that doesn't really fit his style, but I think he should have taken more career risks, should he? There's not really much he could have done. I think he did the right move at the time. If we're talking what he can do from now on, somehow win the belt back, I think it's very unlikely with the amount of killers we've got in the middleweight division now, but if he can somehow pick up he's going to be fighting Imavov next year. If he can beat Imavov and then get a title shot and then win it, that'll be good for Izzy, 3-time middleweight champion, but if he could somehow win the belt back, I guess that boosts him on the greatest of all time list. Matt Hughes, one of the greatest welterweights of all time. Arguments against Matt Hughes. He ended up getting finished a lot towards the end of his career. Now, we didn't go on this massive monumental losing streak that likes of BJ Penn, but he did end up getting finished quite a bit towards the end of his career, and he ended up losing to his best win. GSP was by far his best win, and he ended up losing to him in the future as well. Those are the only really arguments I can make against Matt Hughes because he did have a pretty solid career. How he could be higher on the GOAT list? He should have retired before the rematch with BJ Penn, because obviously the BJ Penn didn't go too well for him, so I think had he retired before the BJ Penn rematch, I think that would have been a good move for Matt Hughes. And there's nothing he really could have done. I think he did exactly what he should have done at the time, like I've said about other guys on this list. And I think he's one of the greatest welterweights of all time, but I don't think there was any move in his career that he did that was, terrible. So that's Matt Hughes. Then we've got Charles Oliveira, recently won at UFC 309, definitely in the top 30 GOAT list. Arguments against Oliveira being one of the greatest of all time. Even in his prime, he's not the top 2 best lightweights of all time. When we talk about GOATs like GSP and Jones, not only were they the greatest in their prime, but they were the greatest out of their prime too. Oliveira is not even the greatest in his prime. Oliveira is in his prime right now, and he has been for the past few years. And when he goes against the likes of Makhachev and Sarukian, he's not even in the top 2 best in his division, so it's hard to argue that he's the greatest of all time or one of the GOATs when he's not even he's not even the best in his own division. He's got 10 career losses, which shows that he's not unbeatable. Featherweight definitely damages his career as well because of how inconsistent he was at featherweight, and he's very vulnerable as well. He got dropped by Poirier, dropped by Gaethje. Michael Chandler nearly finished him in both fights. He got dropped and finished by Makhachev. So he's a very vulnerable guy, Charles Oliveira. I'm not saying he's chinny necessarily, but he doesn't have this unbeatable aura like a guy like Khabib. Now, how he could be higher on the goal list is win that belt by beating Islam. If somehow Oliveira can come back and win the belt against Islam Makhachev, that would be massive for Oliveira's career, boost his legacy massively. And he should have moved up to the lightweight division sooner. He should have stopped cutting weight to become in the featherweight division. If he'd have moved to the lightweight division a lot sooner, it would have been a lot better for his career. I think he would have suffered a lot less losses. His lightweight legacy would have been better. The list goes on. So that's how I think Oliveira could have been greater. And that's basically everything to do with Oliveira. And then for Leon Edwards, I think Leon's in the top 30 greatest of all time list, one of the greatest welterweights. He's only had 2 defenses. Both of them were lackluster decisions. He had a title defense against Usman, which was very lackluster, and he had a title defense against Colby Covington, which was very lackluster. He didn't go on this long, fun reign. He had 2 defenses and they were boring, and he was getting dominated by Usman before the knockout. I'm not saying he didn't get the knockout and we should stop counting him, and I'm not trying to do one of these theoretical what-ifs because it did happen, but he was getting absolutely dominated by Usman before the knockout, and he's got a lack of top opponents on his resume. Apart from Kamaru Usman, who is he really beat? Out of prime Colby Covington, Nate Diaz, Donald Cerrone, Rafael dos Anjos, these are his best wins. He hasn't really beaten a bunch of top opponents. He's not even beaten some of today's best welterweights. Couldn't even beat Bilal. So those are the arguments against Leon. How he could be higher on the GOAT list is if he can continue beating contenders and he can earn that title shot. I think he could, and he can become a 2-time champion. That will definitely boost his career. Like, let's say Leon goes out there and beats the winner of Buckley and Gary. Wait, no, they ain't fighting each other anymore, are they? If he can go out there and beat the winner of, I don't know, if Buckley beats Covington and they do Buckley versus Leon and he can beat Buckley and then he can get a title shot and then win the belt back, that'll be great for Leon. 2-time champ, beating some great contenders of today's middle welterweight career. Unlikely, but if he can do that, that'll be good. And I think he should have gone for the kill against Belal Muhammad in round 5. He was slashing Belal Muhammad with elbows and he was kind of being way too complacent. If he had gone for the kill in Belal Muhammad and become a mythical fighter, Leon Edwards losing a decision or on the way to losing a decision makes a comeback in the round 5 like he did with Usman. If he'd have done that to Belal Muhammad and finished Belal in the 5th round, he'd have been one of the most dangerous 5-round fighters in the UFC, and he'd have beaten Belal Muhammad and kept that welterweight belt. So that's the critiques and how Leon could have been higher. Chuck Liddell. Now, he did fall off in the later stage of his career, did Chuck Liddell. In his prime, he did everything perfect, but he definitely had a massive fall off in the later stage of his career, including fighting Tito Ortiz in 2018, nearly a decade after your prime, over a decade after your prime. That's a big problem for Chuck Liddell. Now, how he could have been higher on the GOAT list, he should have retired after the Rampage KO loss. Once Rampage Jackson knocked him out and ended his reign, that should have been it for Chuck Liddell. Maybe at the time it wasn't the right thing to do, but it would have given him a crazy legacy. This dude was just pure knocking everybody out in the light heavyweight division. He ran the light heavyweight division, suffered a knockout loss to Rampage Jackson. If he'd have just called it quits there, people would have remembered him as being one of the GOATs of the light heavyweight division rather than just another pioneer. So those are how Chuck Liddell could have been higher on the GOAT list and the arguments against him. And then we've got Conor McGregor. Arguments against McGregor, 0 title defenses. I mean, we talk about the likes of Topuria and Khabib only having 1 and 3 defenses. I mean, McGregor's never defended a single belt in his entire life. He's never been able to reign over a division. He's 1 and 3 in his last 4. And it's not even like, you know, he's been fighting in these past couple of years. This goes all the way back to his fight with Khabib in 2018. In the past 6 years, he's 1 and 3 in his last 4, with the only win being over a washed Donald Cerrone as well, who was on a losing streak. So it isn't even like he beat a top opponent. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not saying Conor McGregor, what he did wasn't impressive, but the UFC gave him a pretty easy title run. Like, they let him win the featherweight belt, then he moved up to welterweight to fight Nate Diaz. Has a very tough fight with Nate Diaz, loses it, then has a very controversial decision in the rematch, and then they give him another title shot. It seems like the UFC kind of tailor-made a path to give Conor McGregor the title run. He didn't go through a tough path to win the belt. Well, knocking out Aldo in 13 seconds is impressive, but the actual path to the title shots in both divisions weren't the hardest to do. And the UFC gave him a pretty easy run. How he could be higher on the GOAT list, should have defended at least one of his belts, whether it be the featherweight belt or the lightweight belt. Not having a single defense is a bad look. He should have at least got a defense. And he should have returned to the octagon sooner. Obviously, he got his legs snapped by Dustin Poirier, but since he's been out, he's kind of just been undisciplined. I mean, he's got multiple charges in court. He's been getting drunk. He's been getting drugged up. If this dude has just been a little bit disciplined, and after his leg was healed and he had rehab and everything like that, if he'd just made a UFC comeback and returned to the octagon sooner, I think he would have been able to beat some of these guys. I think nowadays, not only is there no chance of McGregor coming back, but even if he does come back, I don't think there's a single chance of him beating any of these guys today. So those are the arguments against Conor McGregor and how he could have been higher on the GOAT list. TJ Dillashaw. Now, for Dillashaw, arguments against him is he took PEDs, okay? A lot of people disgrace PEDs, and he took some of the worst as well. It wasn't just like he took it isn't like he took dick pills. He took some of the worst PEDs at the time as well, which a lot of people disgrace him for. Ended up taking, what was it, 2 years out of the 3 years out of the UFC, quite some time out of the UFC. And he was obliterated by Sterling, and he robbed Sandhagen in his comeback. Comes back to the UFC, thinking he's the bee's knees, gets robbed against, well, robs Corey Sandhagen. He fought Sandhagen. I thought Sandhagen should have won that fight, robs him, and then gets absolutely obliterated by Aljamain Sterling in his next title fight. And he couldn't even get past Dominick Cruz. When TJ Dillashaw was in his prime, wasn't even the best, couldn't get past Dominick Cruz. Those are the arguments you can make against TJ Dillashaw, but the steroids really put into perspective how much they impacted his career. Would he have even knocked out Garbrandt had he not taken PEDs? Because for all we know, had he not taken PEDs, Garbrandt would have such a bad chin, and he could have had a better career as well. So it was a dick move. How he could have been higher on the GOAT list? He shouldn't have taken PEDs. Like I just said, his legacy wouldn't have been disgraced, and his prime would have lasted longer because he wouldn't have got cut from the UFC and suspended. So his prime could have lasted longer, and he should have made a UFC comeback. Coming back to the UFC only made his career even worse because he got a robbery win over Corey Sandhagen and dominated by Sterling in his last fight. Had that never happened, he would have been remembered, yes, as this, PED disgraceful guy, but at least he would have been able to end with a bang. You know what I mean? So that's how TJ Dillashaw could have been higher on the GOAT list, and what he's done already and the arguments against him. Then for Max Holloway, recently got KO'd at UFC 308. Arguments against Holloway: he's 0-3 against Alexander Volkanovski. He got knocked out by Ilia Topuria, and he lost to McGregor on his come up. When you look at some of the greatest featherweights of all time, in Volk and McGregor and Topuria and Aldo, yes, he beat Aldo twice, but everyone else he's not been able to get past. Lost to McGregor on McGregor's come up, got knocked out by Topuria, 0-3 against Volkanovski, with the third being the most decisive. So it's never really like, apart from in the couple of years that he was a champion, he was the best featherweight in the world. He's 0-2 against Dustin Poirier as well, lost to him at featherweight and then in the lightweight division as well. So Poirier is 2-0 against him as well. And he's not even in the top 2 greatest featherweights of all time. I know there's only been 5 featherweight champions, but Aldo's greater than him. Volkanovski's greater than him. So he's not even in the top 2 conversation for the greatest featherweights. Those are the arguments you can have against Max Holloway. How he could have been higher on the GOAT list? He shouldn't have fought Poirier on short notice. He fought Poirier on short notice in a different division. He didn't give himself enough time to prepare, and we saw in the fight with Justin Gaethje what he looks like when he does actually prepare in the lightweight division. Had he prepared properly against Dustin Poirier, he could have got the win. I'm not saying he would have, but he could have got the win, and that would have been a really good win for his career, beating Dustin Poirier. One less loss, one more win against a solid opponent. And I think from now he should just continue to pick up wins against lightweight contenders. He's now moved to the lightweight division. I don't think he should go on a title run because he's not beating Arman Tsarukyan. He's not beating Islam Makhachev. But I think if you put him against somebody like Charles Oliveira or Michael Chandler or some of these other guys in the lightweight division, because we saw how good he was against Gaethje, he definitely has the capability to beat these guys. So I think for now, just pick up a few more wins in the lightweight division, get a couple of more wins, and I think that would be the right thing to do for Max Holloway. And then for Jon Jones, ending it with a bang. Now, what Jon Jones can do to become the greatest, or what arguments against Jon Jones being the greatest of all time? More steroid test failures in UFC history. It's hard to say that somebody's the greatest fighter of all time when they also have the record for the most steroid test failures in UFC history, which Jon Jones holds the crown to. If you're taking steroids, it shows a lack of confidence, and I'm not saying Jones wouldn't have won without the steroids, but would he have been a dominant without the steroids? Would he have been able to get past some of these guys? You know what I mean? And a lot of people even make the argument that obviously the fight got pulled out. He got pulled out from the fight with DC in one of the fights, and that was when DC was locked in one of the fights where he got pulled out with DC. Had he not taken steroids and had he actually fought DC, he might have even lost that fight. He ducked Ngannou and Aspinall. Yeah, I don't understand why he moved up to the heavyweight division if he's just going to shit on his legacy. Ngannou was the champion. The second that Ngannou leaves the UFC, Jones is back in. And now that Aspinall's on the come up, he's publicly ducked Aspinall in multiple different ways on multiple different times. And I feel like people are only going to remember Jon Jones for being the guy who ducked Tom Aspinall. And even in his prime, he was beating on undersized, out-of-prime light heavyweights. Like, he was fighting these undersized guys for the first half of his light heavyweight career. He was basically fighting middleweights and that were out of their prime. And the second half of his light heavyweight career was having these close fights. Nearly lost to Santos, went to a decision with Anthony Smith, lost to Dominick Reyes, or at least most people think he should have lost to Dominick Reyes. Nearly lost to Gustafsson in the first fight as well. So he was fighting these out of prime light heavyweights, beating up on these undersized guys, and even though I do think it's super impressive what he's done, there's an argument to make that the guys that was fighting in the light heavyweight division weren't super impressive either. How could he be higher on the GOAT list? He shouldn't have taken steroids. I mean, if he hadn't have taken steroids, there is zero argument against Jon Jones being the greatest of all time. He shouldn't have taken 3 years off the spot because I think that he's only got older, he's only got slower, he's probably lost confidence. He's still got the skills. I mean, he's the heavyweight champion, but I think it would have been more beneficial had he stayed in the light heavyweight division or moved up to the heavyweight earlier. And he should fight or beat either Ngannou or Aspinall. Obviously, he can't fight Ngannou anymore, but I think he should have fought and beaten Ngannou or fought and beaten Aspinall, because at least that would have got rid of the duck allegations. And had he beaten Ngannou or Aspinall, infinitely not even close, the greatest of all time. So those are the arguments against Jon Jones and how he could be higher, but that is how I would critique every fighter in my top 30 GOAT list, as well as how they could be higher in the GOAT list. Let me know your thoughts on this video if you agree, disagree, and thank you for watching.